Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Bureau of Disability Services presentation on restrictions. My name is Kate Trackman, Behavior Specialist for Liberty for the Bureau of Disability Services. I am joined today by Kim Cawley, Quality Assurance Director for the Bureau of Disability Services, Shelley Thomas, Outcomes Management Director for the Bureau of Disability Services. We would like to start with just a few housekeeping reminders. Please use chat for immediate technical issues and to answer questions that may be asked throughout the presentation. Use the Q&A button to ask questions. Click closed captioning to see the live transcript. And please complete the evaluation that will be sent in the follow-up email. That email will also serve as the confirmation that you attended this training. The recording will be uploaded to the FSSA YouTube channel after the live sessions have been conducted. Today's agenda will include what does the HCBS settings rule have to say about restrictions? It will define rights modifications and restrictions, both formal and informal. Talk about the role of services, the need for assessment, and how free will and choice impact the rewards and restrictions that are put into place. Nothing about me without me, the importance of individuals leading the decision-making process for services, supports, and restrictions. And we will talk about the importance of restrictions having time limits and the role data-driven decision-making has in the planning process. In September, we began a deep dive into the home and community-based settings rule with the topic of supporting choice. We talked about 6 strategies to support individuals to make choices. Those 6 strategies are having conversations, spending time with the individual, sharing options, helping the individual weigh options, listening, and honoring choice. In our more recent training in February, we demonstrated how those same 6 strategies are related to the part of the settings rule that requires us to treat individuals using services with respect and dignity as they make choices and control their services and supports to manage their life. We recognize that people taking control of their life, being empowered to make choices, can be scary for organizations, families, staff, and the state. The PCISP, by describing what is important to and for the individual, can guide us as supporters to balance our own fears and to protect the individual's right to dignity of risk. The PCISP might include restrictions or modifications to rights, some of which are in behavior support plans and some of which might not be. The HCBS settings rule includes requirements to follow when restricting or modifying individual rights. That is today's topic. It is our hope as we focus on restrictions and modifications that you see how those same 6 strategies are useful in assessing, identifying, designing, implementing, evaluating, and ending modifications or restrictions. It is also our hope that when the team, including the individual, has determined that restrictions or right modifications will be implemented, that service providers continue to ask, acknowledge, and honor the individual's choice and control, recognizing that the individual is driving their services. We will continue our deep dive into the HCBS settings rule in May, when we will address those rules associated with provider-owned and controlled settings. Let's start today with a quick review of the presentation on dignity, respect, and control. Using these 6 strategies are empowering and provide a framework for balancing dignity of risk and our responsibilities or fear. People will feel empowered when we have conversations with them, when we spend time with them, getting to know them, when we support them in learning about options, when we help the individual weigh options, when we listen, when we honor choice. When people are empowered and take control, they exercise free will. Free will is about acting on one's own discretion. People will not feel empowered if we do not ask, listen, and act. Remember, honoring choices and preferences, even when different from our own, is a core value in providing support that emphasizes dignity and respect and promotes control. This reminds me of Nolan, an individual I have had the opportunity to support. Nolan went to see his physician because he was drowsy and not feeling well. Nolan's physician did some testing and discovered Nolan's blood sugar was elevated. His physician recommended that Nolan be careful about what he eats and stop eating foods that were high in concentrated sweets or carbs. The service provider immediately put Nolan on a restricted diet. The staff went through Nolan's home and removed all the foods that were not on Nolan's diet. They threw away his pepperoni, his cookies, and other food that were high in fats, carbs, or sugar. The staff at the service provider imposed this restriction without talking with Nolan about how he felt or what he wanted. The staff did not pay attention to Nolan's cherished routine of making pizza like his mom did every Friday evening. Eating pizza on Friday was very important to Nolan. There were many things that could have been done differently here. Let's go back to the 6 strategies. 1, have conversations to learn about what is important to Nolan and how he feels about the physician's recommendation. Spend time with Nolan to see how changing his diet will impact his life. Share options. Explore with Nolan the many different options to manage his blood sugars: diet, exercise, medication. Help the individual weigh options by discussing or supporting him to find out the risks and benefits of doing nothing, changing his diet, increasing his activity level, making a simple change like giving up soda, or eating more fruits and vegetables. Listen to Nolan, supporting him to take control, and then honor his choice by supporting his decision. Consider this other scenario. I have a colleague who recently had an elevated A1C that indicated that her blood sugar was higher than normal. She asked the nurse practitioner what that meant. The nurse practitioner said Melissa could take medication. Melissa asked if there were other options, and the nurse practitioner said that Melissa could eat healthier foods like vegetables and fruit and reduce her intake of sugars and other carbs like bread and sweet tea, and exercise. Melissa went with the option to choose healthier foods and increase her activity level. Melissa is excited after a few weeks to have more energy, lose a few pounds, and is looking forward to a follow-up appointment to see if her A1C has improved. Melissa's experience was different than Nolan's. Much of the difference was who was in control. Nolan's staff took control. Melissa took control. Take a second and think about your own life. Hopefully, you've never had the experience, especially as an adult, that someone took control of your life. How do you think you would feel if you were treated like Nolan? Do you think it would work if someone restricted your diet? How would you feel if you were treated like Melissa? Do you think it is more likely to work if you make your own choices? Learning from Nolan what was important to him by having conversations and spending time with him would have helped Nolan explore his feelings, wants, and needs. Sharing options and helping Nolan weigh options would have helped Nolan learn about his new health concerns and ways to manage his elevated blood sugars, including the risks and benefits. If staff had listened to what Nolan was saying and doing and honored his choices, there may not have been a reason to be so restrictive or intrusive. Nolan may have chose to make healthier choices about his diet and activities. This is a good time to talk about dignity of risk again. In several sessions, we have talked about the dignity of risk and the value of making decisions and learning from mistakes. Here's a video about dignity of risk. We used this video the last time we talked about rights modifications and restrictions. It's poignant and relevant to this topic. Max describes the importance of learning from mistakes.
One thing that is really big in self-advocacy and the work that I do, and we discuss it a lot, is the dignity of risk. The dignity of risk is the opportunity and the right to make mistakes. It's one thing to be told things through lecture, But how else can you learn if you don't make mistakes? Life is about learning from the mistakes you make. I appreciate, and we appreciate, protection from people. But please don't protect us too much or at all from living our lives. We are going to have to encounter failures through decisions that we make. But the way to conquer that is to get up on your feet, brush yourself off, and learn from that, because people grow by encountering failures and making mistakes in their life. It's really the number one way of learning of where lines are drawn, and also it helps with learning about yourself. The dignity at risk is one of many opportunities that people with disabilities deserve to have. It's one thing just to give them like only a select few, but clearly, even saying in the Americans with Disabilities Act, people with disabilities deserve to live their lives with no limits of opportunity. It really opens the doors for people with disabilities to really discover what is out there and to take advantage of what is out there and not be limited to only certain things due to the overprotection that people with disabilities unfortunately have to live with.
Max cautions us about overprotection. He reminds us that life is about learning. We all learn from our life experiences. We may learn more from our mistakes than our successes. Experience is a powerful teacher. Many of us learned valuable lessons through trial and error. Sometimes we learn our lesson on the first trial. Sometimes we try the same thing and hope for different results. Some of us are still doing the same old thing and not getting what we want. We learn differently. Often, when individuals receiving waiver services keep doing the same thing, service providers set out to limit mistakes by restricting the individual or modifying their rights. Let's review what the HCBS settings rule says. The HCBS settings rule requires these rights for people with disabilities who are receiving waiver services. People have a right to privacy. People have a right to make choices. People have a right to choose where they get help and services. People have a right to be around other people in their community. People have a right to do the same things in the community that everyone else does. People have a right to do things in the community with people who do not have a disability. People have a right to get a job working with people who do not have a disability. The rule ensures individual rights of privacy, dignity, and respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint. The rule optimizes autonomy and independence in making life choices and facilitates choice regarding services and who provides them. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to talk in great detail about additional requirements for provider-owned or controlled home and the community-based residential settings in May. It may be helpful to briefly mention them now. These requirements include the individual has a lease or other legally enforceable agreement providing similar protections. The individual has privacy, including lockable doors, choice of roommates, and freedom to furnish or decorate. The individual controls his or her schedule, including access to food at any time. The individual can have visitors at any time, and the setting is physically accessible. It's important for today's presentation to know that these are the expectations as we talk about restrictions and modifications. Any modification to the HCBS settings rule must be supported by a specific assessed need and justified in the person-centered plan. What is a rights restriction or a modification? CMS chose to use the word modification in the settings rule and talking about modifications to describe what we, in the service delivery system, have historically called restrictions. CMS framed the limiting rights, community access, and control as modifications because the individual with their person-centered team can temporarily modify rights if they follow the requirements set out in the settings rule. A modification is the process described in the settings rule that we follow when there is an assessed need to impose a restriction. A rights restriction is a limitation to the rights of an individual due to a specific assessed need to support the health, safety, and well-being of the individual. A rights restriction can only be used to address a real and immediate risk to the health and safety of the individual or others. Some examples of rights restrictions include taking away a person's iPad, restricting access to the internet, locking knives or scissors, or alarms that sound when the door is opened. Although the settings rule does not specifically address legal, civil, and human rights, the rule ensures that individuals using services and supports experience life in the same way as people who are not using services. When we talk about restrictions to rights, we are not limiting the discussion to those few rights specifically listed in the rule, but the more global people using HCBS settings rule have the same legal, civil, and human rights as everyone else. CQL developed a video to help people using services to understand rights restrictions and modifications. Let's take a few minutes to look at that video.
The settings rule was put into place by the federal government to make sure people get the best services they can. But people are different. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to services. Some people may need a lot of support, and some may need just a little. Some people may need support every day, and others may just need support occasionally. The new settings rule talks about your rights. In the clip called "What Does the Rule Guarantee?" we talk about your rights. But sometimes there are times when your rights are restricted or modified in order to keep you safe and provide you with the best support. When you cannot do something you want to do, or when someone controls you in some way, this is called a restriction. Before a provider, the agency that provides you support, can restrict any of your rights, they need to do a lot of paperwork to show that they tried to do everything possible to avoid putting a restriction in place. And you need to be a part of these discussions and decisions. So when you need extra support, or when you are not able to take part in all of the freedoms the new rules provide, what happens? What does the provider have to show? First, they need to base the restriction on a specific need. So, for example, if a person had Prader-Willi syndrome and having unlimited access to food might make them sick, then the provider might work with them and decide it is best to keep food locked away and control what food the person has access to. But if there is no medical reason to stop you from getting food when you want, then the restriction probably doesn't make sense. They cannot restrict your rights for no good reason. Another thing providers need to do is show that they have tried other less restrictive interventions, but they didn't work. And they need to write about the other things they tried in your records. So, for example, staff cannot lock up the knives in the house because they're scared you might hurt yourself cutting a bagel. They would need to show that they did other things before taking away your rights, like teaching you to use a knife properly or other things that might keep you from hurting yourself. The providers need to collect data and other information on the restriction so they can track over time if it is helping you or not. If it isn't helping you, then they need to work with you to find other things to try. They should also have a plan to restore or give back your rights. Just because they remove your rights doesn't mean you lose them forever. The restriction is for a defined or limited period of time, and they need to meet with you regularly to talk about the restriction and if it is still necessary. And the restriction cannot hurt you in any way. Nobody should harm you. Providers and support staff are there to help you. Finally, they need to get your consent. You need to agree to the restriction. This means your provider needs to explain to you why they want to restrict your rights, how they think it will help you, explain any risks there might be, and go over the timeline for when they will reassess if it is working. If you have any questions, they need to answer them for you and explain it in a way that you understand. If you don't understand, you need to speak up.
This video clearly defines right restrictions or modifications and introduces the requirements CMS put in place for service providers to follow to restrict or modify a right or rule. Simply put, a restriction or modification occurs when a person cannot do something they want or when someone else controls what the individual does. The rule allows the individual with their person-centered team to put in place safeguards to promote the health, safety, and well-being of the individual using HCBS and others. The rule does not allow modification of the requirement that the provider-owned and controlled setting meets the physical accessible needs of the individual. Any other right can be modified by following the requirements set forth in the settings rule. The individual and their team, through a person-centered planning process, may decide it is necessary to restrict or modify an individual's right where after all options for less restrictive interventions have been unsuccessful. There must be a balance between the provider's responsibility to promote health, safety, and well-being and the individual's right to make decisions in their life. Rights can be restricted or modified after the team's thoughtful and deliberate consideration of the severity and likelihood of negative outcomes related to health and safety. Rights can be limited or modified only when truly necessary and according to the requirements in the settings rule. Unfortunately, during quality on-site provider reviews, complaint investigations, and incident reviews, we sometimes find restrictions or modifications that do not follow the requirements of the settings rule. Frequently, this is because of the organization's rules and/or practices or the actions of specific staff. These restrictions and modifications are not typically found in PCISPs, BSPs, or risk plans. Limitations may be in established policies, procedures, and rules. Others are the result of historical or outdated practices or the actions of specific staff or groups of staff. Some examples include rules or practices such as requiring individuals to use a particular bank, pharmacy, or grocery store, limiting access to areas of the individual's home, such as offices that are locked or simply off limits, or identifying a staff-only bathroom. Remember, this is the person's home where they may get services, but it is not a service setting. Requiring or expecting individuals to follow visiting hours or ask permission for visitors. If the individuals currently living in the home establish visiting hours or require each other to ask permission, it may not be a restriction. Imposing restrictions for everyone because one person has a rights modification or restriction. We find sometimes that one person has a restriction in their BSP that limits their access to cleaning supplies. This practice restricts or modifies the rights of other individuals who share the home who are not at risk for injury or harm. This is a perfect time to ask the individuals what works best for them. Acknowledge what they want and honor the choice that they make. There are other ways to support those who are not at risk to be able to access dish soap, laundry detergent, and other cleaning products. Some examples include individuals might have keys to the lock cabinet. They may be able to store cleaning supplies in a place the individual who is at risk does not typically go. Requiring individuals to follow a specific diet, drink certain beverages, or not eat or drink specific things. Sometimes we find general restrictions like everyone follows a healthy heart diet because that is what the organization has decided is best, or no one has caffeinated beverages, or we only buy skim milk. Other times we find that a dietitian, nurse, or physician has made a recommendation. So, like for Nolan, the provider decides Nolan will follow that recommendation. There are many things that each of us could do to be healthier. Maybe it's something recommended by a professional or by someone we know, or perhaps it's something that we know we should do. We, just like people using HCBS, are in control of what our diet should be. scheduling activities away from home based on the needs of the support staff or provider. The individual controls their own schedule. That includes things like going to the store, visiting friends, or going places that the individual wants. Oftentimes, support staff or providers will develop a schedule based on when staff are available or when others in the home are going or want to go. Whether the limitation is part of a policy or based on historical or outdated practices, they must be reviewed as required. Before we move forward, let's take a second and answer a poll question. Which of the following are examples of rights restrictions due to common practices or rules? Choose all that apply. We'll give people a couple seconds to answer the poll, and then we will talk about the results. We will give everybody about 10 more seconds, and then we will end the poll. Okay, so from the poll information, it looks like a majority of people answered everyone must be gone from the house from 8:30 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. because there is no staff scheduled to work. And we put parental controls on the television that only allowed G-rated movies. Remember, when a person cannot do something they want, or when someone else controls what the individual does, it is a restriction. When individuals are not allowed to be in their home, can't watch what they want on television, this is considered a rights restriction. When people have access to foods when they want and can go out when they want, they're in control of their schedule and exercising their rights. These practices may not be documented in the PCISP, BSP, or risk plans, but are restrictions. You must follow the same requirements for these actions as all other restrictions. It is important to be vigilant and to identify practices put into place that do not have HRC approval. Some organizations encourage their Human Rights Committee or advocates and self-advocates to visit people in their homes or services or use their grievance system to help identify these practices. A modification is the process described in the settings rule that we follow when there is an assessed need to impose a restriction. Any restrictions, formal or informal, are not permissible without following the requirements laid out in the HCBS settings rule. We will talk about those requirements in a few minutes. There are also formal restrictions that are typically described in BSPs, risk plans, and the PCISP. Formal restrictions include things like an individual is not allowed to use the internet, individuals are not permitted to have visitors in their bedroom with the door closed, individuals are not permitted to spend their money on video games. You could probably add some more from your own experiences. In risk plans, we see restrictions limiting what food or amount of food individuals can have, requirements to earn time alone, or not being allowed to carry their debit card with them. In the PCISP, we see restrictions limiting the use of phone, including when or where, or if staff have to be present or not, or saying people can only watch movies rated PG or general family. In the PCISP, We see restrictions to decision-making and managing finances by having a rep payee or a guardian. These are formal restrictions and require the provider and the team to follow the requirements set out in the settings rule. Let's take another poll. What % of individuals supported by your organizations have formal restrictions in their BSP, PCISP, or risk plan, including rep payee or guardian? We will give people a couple seconds to answer, and then we'll talk about the results. We will give people about 10 more seconds, and then we will share the results of the poll. As you can see, there is a pretty big variety of results, with 4% of people saying 100% of people have restrictions, 23% saying 75 to 99%, 24% saying 50 to 74%, 18% saying 25 to 49%, 29% saying 1 to 24%, and 2% saying 0%. Typically, many individuals using HCBS have restrictions. The settings rule attempts to reduce that number by ensuring that there is a focus on protecting rights and ensuring people have the same access to community as people not using HCBS. The settings rule challenges us to do better. Some of the things that we have done to protect people and their possessions are very restrictive. To ensure that we do better, some organizations have a process for reviewing PCISPs, BSPs, risk plans, house rules, policies, procedures, and practices to ensure they are in compliance with the settings rule. Whether the restriction is formal or informal, the settings rule does not discriminate. Remember, when a person cannot do something they want, or when someone else controls what the individual does, it is a restriction or modification. Providers are required to follow the same rules for formal or informal restrictions or modifications. The settings rule requires the process for implementing a rights restriction to be person-centered. The restriction must be justified and documented in the PCISP. The following are requirements that must be included in the documentation: a specific and individualized assessed need, the positive interventions and support used prior to any modification or restriction, less intrusive methods of meeting the need that have been tried but did not work, a clear description of the condition that is directly proportionate to the specific assessed need, a regular collection and review of data to measure the ongoing effectiveness of the modification, establish time limits for periodic reviews to determine if the modification is still necessary or can be terminated, informed consent of the individual, and an assurance that interventions and supports will cause no harm to the individual. Rights can only be limited based on a specific assessed need to support the health, safety, and well-being of the individual or the community. Essentially, this means that the restriction or modification must be based on observations, data, and other information gathering strategies for that individual. In considering the 6 strategies of supporting people to make choices, the assessment will likely include conversations with the person and spending time with the person to learn about what is important to and for the person, to learn about preferences, needs, and personal goals. It will likely involve exploring options, evaluating those options, listening to the person, and honoring choice. Perhaps this graphic from a previous training opportunity last year will be helpful to us. The first step is to look at what right is being modified, then identifying the specific modification being considered and why. The why is the health and/or safety reason the person-centered team is considering the modification and how the team knows this. In other words, what data, observations, or information supports the need for the modification. There must be data that has been reviewed that supports the need for the restriction. If there is not a health and/or safety reason, the restriction or modification is not allowed. If there is not sufficient data, observations, or information to support the need, the restriction or modification is not allowed. The next consideration is to examine what other interventions have been tried and not been effective. Let's consider an example. What? In the next few slides, we're going to talk about Morgan. First, we have to answer the question, what is the specific modification being considered? In the person-centered team's meeting that included Morgan, they determined that a reasonable restriction, and one that Morgan agreed to, was to limit her alcoholic intake of 1 per 48-hour period. The answer to what, or the specific modification, is that the team is considering limiting Morgan to 1 drink during a 48-hour time frame. Why? In looking at the data and other information, the team determined that the restriction was justified because of Morgan's history of drinking in excess at times. One medication Morgan takes interacts with alcohol. Morgan has had 3 emergency room visits in the last 6 weeks due to the interaction between her medication and alcohol. Because of these interactions, the physician recommended Morgan limit her consumption of alcoholic drinks to 1 drink in a 48-hour period. What did they try? They tried education. The doctor, staff, and Morgan had conversations about the medication and how the medication interacted with her drinking. They explored other options. Morgan and her supporters talked to the doctor about other medications that might be effective treatment but would not interact with drinking. They tried coaching. When Morgan was considering drinking, the staff took advantage of those moments to have conversations with Morgan about the medication, drinking, and the risks. The team described the condition that is directly proportionate to Morgan's assessed needs, saying, Morgan's alcohol consumption was not a concern prior to the addition of a new medication that has negative interactions with alcohol. The doctor and staff educated Morgan on the risks associated with the medication and alcohol. When Morgan required medical interventions, the ER visits, staff had documented Morgan had consumed alcohol 2 to 3 days in a row. After the first ER visit, staff worked through the informed decision-making process with Morgan when she was contemplating whether she should drink or not. This was not sufficient for Morgan, and she chose to drink multiple days in a row, putting her health at risk. The settings rule requires documentation of a specific and individualized assessed need, of the positive interventions and supports used prior to any modification or restriction, of less intrusive methods of meeting the need that have been tried but did not work, of a clear description of the condition that is directly proportionate to the specific assessed need. In summary, the team, including Morgan, identified a health and safety risk by assessing the situation based on data and observation. They tried less restrictive interventions to justify the implementation of a restriction, but they are not finished yet. The settings rule requires documentation of a regular collection and review of data to measure the ongoing effectiveness of the modification, establish time limits for periodic reviews to determine if the modification is still necessary or can be terminated, informed consent of the individual, and an assurance that the interventions and supports will cause no harm to the individual. The team must develop a system for collecting data, establishing time limits for review, getting informed consent, and assuring the intervention and support will cause no harm. Morgan, with the team, determined that they would collect data each time Morgan consumed alcohol, including observations of symptoms and whether medical intervention was necessary. Each time Morgan considered or talked about drinking, when staff worked through the decision-making regarding drinking, and when that intervention was effective in Morgan choosing to follow the restriction, the 1 drink in a 48-hour period, or when it was not effective, when she drank more than 1 drink in a 48-hour period. Remember that even though Morgan has agreed to the restriction, she can withdraw her consent at any time. That means she may choose to have more than 1 drink in a 48-hour period without more aggressive methods to stop her. The team determined that the restriction would be reviewed at a minimum quarterly at the PCISP meeting and by the Human Rights Committee. The review must also be documented. Data will be reviewed monthly. The restriction will be discontinued when the medication that has a negative interaction with alcohol is discontinued, or when Morgan demonstrates she is able to choose, with or without staff support, to not have more than 1 drink within a 48-hour period for 3 consecutive months. As mentioned just a few minutes ago, the restriction also requires individuals' informed consent. Using plain language, the team will describe the intervention, the risks, and benefits, including why it is necessary to ensure Morgan's health and safety, and will do Morgan or others no harm. This will be signed by Morgan and the rest of the team. Morgan did not have a legal guardian, but if she did, the legal guardian would be asked for consent. We have to remember that the individual can give informed consent and they can take it away. Just as we honor their consent, we must honor their lack of consent. The HCBS settings rule requires that any restrictions are based on a specific individualized assessed need related to the health, safety, and well-being, that positive interventions and supports have been tried and not worked prior to restrictions, that there is ongoing data collection that is routinely reviewed, that restrictions are time-limited and temporary, that the individual and their guardian give informed consent, and that the intervention will do no harm. In order to protect the rights of individuals, service providers should include a quality assurance and quality improvement system that looks at the organization's practices and systems around modifications and rights restrictions. CMS developed some requirements for provider-owned and controlled settings that could be helpful for all service providers who are supporting individuals who are experiencing rights restrictions. The questions should be asked and answered annually for provider-owned and controlled settings. The person-centered team should evaluate whether they have met the HCBS settings rule, and when they haven't, they should address it. In our work, we have discovered some omissions or found opportunities to do better. For example, consistent data collection. The team was concerned about the data. They discovered an alarming increase in the data for Connor's inappropriate sexual behavior. For several months, Connor had no incidents of inappropriate sexual behavior, and then it spiked to 32 incidents in a month. In exploration, the STAR team found that the recent increase was due to staff reporting when Connor spoke to another adult in a sexual manner. It is critical that there is a clear definition of the behavior that's being tracked. Neither inappropriate sexual behavior or talking to another person in a sexual manner is a clear definition. When behaviors are not clearly defined, the data is not helpful in evaluating whether the restrictions or modifications are needed. Time-limited or temporary restrictions. About 5 years ago, Antonio was sitting in the front seat of a van He was upset and managed to unbuckle his seatbelt and grab the driver's arm. The van swerved on the highway, but the driver managed to avoid an accident. Since that time, Antonio has not been allowed to sit in the front seat. Restrictions should always be time limited or temporary. The frequency of Antonio's behavior should be considered in addition to the risk to himself and others. The team needs to be sure to identify when the right will be restored or when the limitation will be eliminated. Collecting and using data is an effective tool to ensure you have systems in place to demonstrate that you are protecting and promoting rights and that you do not unnecessarily keep people from doing what they want or controlling what individuals do, that restrictions are reduced or eliminated as soon as possible, and that you honor and respect the person's wants and needs. With data-driven decision-making, you can determine if and when restrictions are necessary and when to back off or eliminate restrictions. When behaviors occur infrequently and do not pose a risk of injury or harm to the person or others, you may be able to use positive behavior support strategies. For example, Perry, around major holidays like Hanukkah, hurts himself by scratching his arms. Laverne discovered that if she takes Perry for a drive to his old neighborhood and stops by one of his favorite bakeries, that he is less likely to hurt himself. This behavior does not occur frequently, the scratching is not severe, and positive strategies are working. Using data, you can determine that restrictions are not likely necessary. In other situations, the behavior may occur infrequently, but be very serious, so that the team reacts quickly in putting in safeguards that will protect the person while teaching alternative behaviors and providing other supports. For example, Savannah, in periods of extreme stress like a breakup or learning that someone she cares about has a serious health condition. When she experiences mild stress, she uses yoga, meditation, and/or positive self-talk to manage her stress. She routinely practices these strategies. However, they are less effective when Savannah is experiencing extreme stress. When experiencing extreme stress, Savannah has a history of hurting herself by cutting herself. When Savannah begins cutting, the team has to react quickly to protect her. These behaviors are rare and may not have occurred for months, maybe even a full year, but are severe. There are other situations where the behavior occurs frequently and poses an immediate threat for harm to the person or others. Good data collection systems will help the team to determine what interventions are needed and for how long. Data can be counting frequency of specific behaviors, checklists, descriptions of the behavior, and situation. Data-driven decision-making ensures that you, as a responsible provider, are using restrictions only when absolutely necessary. In addition to using data-driven decision-making, it is imperative that the team asks the individual for their input, acknowledges how they feel about what is going on and what possible solutions they have considered, and then honors the choices that the individual makes. If an individual does not choose to have a modification to one of their rights, then the modification should not be put in place. We have discussed throughout this presentation and recent training on respect, dignity, and control the importance of nothing about me without me. When thinking about modifications and assessments, nothing about me without me is key. Individuals should be guiding their waiver support services from start to end and throughout all the conversations in between. Here's a short video put together by Colorado Health to explain the individual's role in rights modifications or restrictions.
I'm Olivia, the Health First Colorado member you met in the last video. Even though I have the same rights as anyone else, I may sometimes decide to limit my rights, to do what is best for me. For example, I have the right to privacy in my bedroom. Usually, that would mean I could lock my bedroom door. But the staff where I live and my doctor were worried about that because sometimes I have seizures. If I lock my door at night when I go to bed and I have a seizure, it might take them longer to get in and help me. So the staff at my apartment suggested a rights modification. A rights modification is a limit on one of your rights. In my case, the limit is that I do not lock my bedroom door. It is up to me whether to limit my rights. If you have a guardian, it might be up to them. Here is how I made my decision. First, I thought about the risks that my doctor and staff were worried about. If I don't get help right away during a seizure, I could get hurt. I might even have to go to the hospital. That has happened to me before. Next, I thought about other ways I have tried to stay safe. I tried a medication that stopped my seizures for a few years, but now the seizures are back, and we don't know of any other medication that will work as well. I thought about how not being able to lock my door at night would affect my life. I would have less privacy because I could not lock people out, but I would still have some privacy because I could still shut the door. My housemates and staff would always have to knock and wait for me to say, "Come in," except if it sounded like I was having a seizure. My case manager explained that I didn't have to agree to keep my door unlocked. She carefully reviewed some paperwork with me, and we talked about it. I still wasn't ready to decide, though. I really like my privacy. My case manager told me I could take my time, and she gave me some ideas of how to get help and information to make my decision. First, she reminded me that I can talk with my cousin. He helps me think things through a supported decision-making agreement. But the decision is mine. You can learn more about supported decision-making. My cousin said we should talk to an advocate. There are lots of advocates in Colorado. With my permission, he reached out to the local ARC. They helped me understand my rights, and they can help you too. They can also help you protect your rights. There are even groups that can help you become an advocate for yourself. I also talked to my roommates because they have been in similar situations. One has agreed to a rights modification, and one has not. They helped me learn about the process. In the end, I decided I should not lock my bedroom door. I signed the informed consent form to make it official. I know I can easily change my mind in the future if I want to. I can easily tell my staff or case manager that I no longer agree with the rights modification. In 6 months, my staff and case manager will check with me to see how it's going. If I can go 6 months without having a seizure at night, or if there is a new medication to try, I might start locking my door again. Of course, there are all kinds of rights and all kinds of rights modifications. If you have questions, ask. You can start by asking your case manager, and they can help you take it from there. If you think staff are violating your rights, you can discuss that with your case manager. Or you can talk with the advocates I mentioned before. You can also...
In this video, Olivia talked about how she decided if she wanted to agree to a rights modification. She explained why she was considering a rights modification, how she evaluated the risks and benefits, including speaking with her cousin and her roommates, and how even though she agreed that she will look at it again with her team in 6 months, she could withdraw her consent before that.
Email Health First Colorado.
Let's take a few seconds and answer a few more poll questions. Is this restriction justified? Tammy must be within line of sight at all times. Tammy is new to our services. We will reassess the need for supervision after 30 days. I will give people a couple seconds to answer this poll, and then we will discuss the results. We will give people about 10 more seconds, and then we will share the results. 25% of people said this restriction is justified. 67% said this restriction is not justified, and 9% said I'm not sure. Those of you that chose B, this restriction is not justified, are correct. There is no individualized assessment or data that indicates there is a health or safety risk that justifies this restriction. It would have been justified if the organization had data or information that said Tammy has a history of running away when she is in a new place. Based on the data from her family, it typically takes a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks before Tammy is comfortable with a change. After she's comfortable, she is no longer at risk of running away. The restriction will be removed in 30 days. Of course, if data indicates there are health and safety concerns, Tammy and her team may choose a new or continued restriction. It's great to see that the restriction is based on an individualized assessment and is time limited. There are several other things that we would expect to see in the documentation, including strategies to increase Tammy's comfort, data collection with a schedule for review, what positive interventions and supports that were attempted and did not work, a clear description of why the running away is a health and safety concern. For example, perhaps she gets lost easily and can't find her way back to new places easily. Strangers don't usually understand her communication, or she has a medical condition that puts her at risk. We would expect to see informed consent and assurances that the supervision will cause no harm. It's great when a plan like this talks about when Tammy has privacy. For example, when Tammy is on the phone in her bedroom, when she's doing her personal care in her bedroom or bathroom, or when she is sleeping, she can close the door for privacy. Now, if Tammy had been in HCBS or other services, the restriction for line of sight may be justified with data from those services. However, in this example, the restriction was put in place based on the provider's policy for new admissions. For the next poll, Jennifer cannot have access to fire starting items such as lighters and matches. Jennifer does not understand the dangers of fire. She has a documented history of starting fires. According to her behavior support plan, she set a fire 4 times in the last 12 months. Her BSP indicates they have tried education, including fire safety classes, volunteering at the fire department, and discussions with medical staff who have worked in hospitals with people who have been burned in fires. She usually starts fire by setting the carpet on fire. We'll give people a couple seconds to answer the poll, and then we will talk about the results. We'll give people about 10 more seconds. About 97% of people said the restrictions justified, 2% said not justified, and 2% said I am not sure. Yes, the restriction is justified. There is a health and safety risk, not just for Jennifer, but also for the people who live with her and the community. It would be better if there was more data rather than just history and an assessment of when the behavior typically occurs. This helps the person-centered team to identify support strategies. And of course, there are other pieces of documentation that are required. And for the last poll, Damon cannot have a lock on his bathroom door. He does not care if there is a lock on his door. We'll give people a couple seconds to answer and we'll talk about the results. We'll give people about 10 more seconds. "15% of people said the restriction is justified. 77% said this restriction is not justified, and 9% said that they were not sure. This restriction is not justified. There is no individualized assessed need for the restriction. There is no data that indicates there is any health or safety risk. This is a typical response when we ask about restrictions. During quality on-site provider reviews, we are told that the individual, like Damon, does not want a lock on his bathroom door, or maybe does not care that there are alarms on their doors, or maybe that they don't mind that they have to ask for a knife to butter their toast or ask staff to cut their sandwich for them. For any restriction or modification to the rule, there must be an individualized assessment. The restriction must be proportionate to the need, and there must be a health and safety risk." In wrapping up, let's review. The HCBS settings rule aims to ensure that people using HCBS experience life in the community in the same way as people not using HCBS. They have the same rights and protections as anyone else. Protecting and promoting rights is as important as keeping people safe and healthy. When a person cannot do something they want, or when someone else controls what the individual does, that is a restriction. The HCBS settings rule recognizes that to protect health, safety, and well-being, the person-centered team that always includes the individual may determine a restriction is necessary. The rule requires that any restrictions are based on specific individualized assessed need related to health, safety, and well-being, that positive interventions and supports have been tried and not worked prior to use of restrictions, and that there is an ongoing data collection that's routinely reviewed, that restrictions are time-limited or temporary, that their individual or their legal guardian or legal decision maker, if there is one, gives informed consent, and that the intervention will do no harm. These are necessary safeguards to protect the rights of individuals using HCBS. This brings us to the end of our presentation. As always, we want to remind you of our mission to ensure that all people are empowered to live, love, work, learn, play, and pursue their dreams. If you need additional information, please contact us at the 800 number below or at bds.help@fssa.in.gov. As always, this is a reminder for you to stay connected with the Indiana Bureau of Disability Services by signing up for the DDARS listserv, and don't forget to follow the Indiana Bureau of Disability Services on Facebook. The BDS Quality Assurance website includes information on the quality on-site provider review process, previously presented webinars, home and community-based settings rule, and investigations, and is an important resource to use when looking for tools you can implement. Also included on this additional resources slide is the link to Open Futures Learning, Charting the Life course, and the Person-Centered Risk Management training. You will find on this slide the links to the videos used in today's presentation. You will receive a follow-up email from Zoom. Please complete the evaluation included in that email so we can improve future trainings, and thank you for coming today. Kim, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you, Kate. We did not have very many questions. I did answer them to the best of my ability. However, the same caveat I gave last time, we will post all of the Q&A on our FAQ. So on that BEADS quality website that was mentioned. So please feel free to go and check back, as some of the questions that were asked at this time might have some additional information added to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you all for joining us today.